Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Aviation Nerd Podcast. Today, we have a very special guest. She served over 24 years active duty in the United States Air Force, flying the famous A-10 Warthog. When she was in the Middle East flying a combat mission, she ended up getting hit by enemy fire, but was able to miraculously survive the hour-long flight home with a battle-damaged A-10 and still survive to tell the tale. After she retired from the Air Force, she published a book called Flying in the Face of Fear, and now does keynote presentations sharing the lessons that she learned throughout her 24-year career. So please help me welcome Kim Campbell, call sign Killer Chick, to the podcast. So yeah, clearly, as we can see behind you, you have had an incredible career in aviation. And so I'm just curious, there's always been a moment for everybody that they maybe look up at an air show and see something and they say, that's what I want to do. So what was that moment really like for you?
Yeah, my moment was a little different than an air show, but I was watching the launch of the Space Shuttle Challenger. I was in fifth grade at the time, and there was something like obviously very exciting about this launch of the space shuttle. But then the tragedy that kind of played out in front of us as we watched, the destruction of the Challenger. There was something in that moment, and it still seems a little crazy to me, but I think realizing that the astronauts died doing something that they believed in, something that was bigger and more important than themselves, there's something that just hit me with that. Like, that was the moment I was like, you know what, I want to do something that's more important than just me. And so I decided in fifth grade that I wanted to be an astronaut. And that really started my path on aviation and my desire to go to the Air Force Academy, my desire to be a fighter pilot. It really started with that one moment.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm sure a lot of people probably saw that incident happen and thought, I don't want to do that. But that's really
Yeah.
interesting that you did end up going on to do that. But you did, like you mentioned, you did go on to attend the Air Force Academy. So how did you decide that you wanted to go to the Air Force Academy?
Well, once I told my parents that I wanted to be an astronaut, I have to admit, I don't think my parents actually believed that it was something that I'd stick with or something that I would follow through with, just because at the time I wasn't super interested in school. And, there were just a few other things that I had on my mind at that time. But again, I was in fifth grade. But my dad said, look, if you want to be an astronaut, the best way to do it is many of them are pilots. Many of them come from the Air Force Academy. And so you might consider that. And again, I think, he had no idea that his 10-year-old little girl would actually commit to that. But that's really what drove me to go to the academy. I was like, okay, well, if that's the path, then that's the path I'll take. And I really put everything I had into going to the Air Force Academy. Obviously, it's an incredibly challenging school to get into. And I was rejected on my first attempt, but was able to get a late offer of appointment. So, some bumps in the road along the way to achieving that goal. But that was it. It was really just a suggestion from my dad of something I might consider.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, the Air Force Academy is very difficult to get into. You are the first person I've had on the show that has actually attended the Air Force Academy. You, like you mentioned, did not get in the first try, which is pretty common. Most people do not get into the Air Force Academy. But you were very persistent, from what I understand, as far as getting in. So do you want to talk a little bit about how persistent you really were and where that came from?
Yeah. So, and when I was in high school and prepping for college, my parents really wanted me to apply to multiple schools. And I really had zero interest in any schools other than the Air Force Academy, but I ended up applying to a few other places. And I was really hopeful because I worked really hard to go to the academy. I mean, I got good grades, I did athletics, I participated in extracurricular activities, you name it. I really pushed myself to be well-rounded and good at all of those things. Wasn't spectacular at the SAT. So we'll put that out there. I eventually took the ACT and did much better. But I really put everything I had into that. And so when I opened the mailbox, right, that's how we got things back in the day. But I opened the mailbox and saw this letter from the academy and ripped it open. And what I thought was going to be excitement, and saw this note that said, thanks for applying, but it's highly competitive and we wish you the best of luck. I mean, it was pretty devastating because I worked so hard and put everything into it. Thankfully, I was surrounded by great, parents, mentors, teachers, coaches who really pushed me to, not quit on it because it's so much of what I wanted in my life. And I decided to write the Air Force Academy a letter every week to tell them anything I had done to improve. So more push-ups, pull-ups, sit-ups, you name it, an A on a test. I didn't care. I just wanted to write them and let them know I was still interested. And then I eventually got those ACT scores, which probably helped as well. But I eventually got the late offer of appointment just 2 weeks before basic training was going to start. So I had other plans. I had kind of had to go with my backup plan. And I think it goes to show you sometimes those rejections that you face in life, as painful as they are in the moment, for me, that gave me that almost chip on my shoulder that when I got to the academy, I didn't want to just like survive. I really wanted to excel.
Yeah, you wanted to prove that you had earned that spot, and that is a very impressive amount of persistence. And I imagine a lot of people would get that rejection letter and just think, all right, well, whatever, gave it a shot. I'll give up now. But yeah, that's very impressive. But
And I think I'll add one thing. I would say that you mentioned it earlier. It's actually more common than you think that people get rejected and maybe even spend a year somewhere else, but it's still what they want. And so they come back to it. Once I shared that story, I found so many of my classmates had the similar thing, that they got a rejection letter and then came back another year and made it. So it's more common. And it's definitely, especially for people that are at that stage in their life, if it's what you want, keep after it.
Yeah, that's really good advice. And I imagine going to the Air Force Academy, not only just getting in, but imagine actually attending the Air Force Academy would present a lot of challenges in and of itself. So what were some of the challenges that you faced there, and how did you overcome them?
Well, I think it's challenging for one physically. Thankfully, my dad is an academy grad, and he was very persistent with me as well in terms of if I was going to go to the academy, he wanted to make sure that I was physically fit and ready to go. And I had played soccer in high school and ran cross country and track. So running was no problem for me, but upper body strength was a little bit of a different story. And so I worked really hard on the push-ups and pull-ups. In fact, he installed a pull-up bar in my bathroom so that I could max the pull-ups once I got there. So for me, the physical fitness aspect, it was challenging, but I was able to eventually max the fitness test my freshman year. Physical fitness aside, it's the time management of everything. It's trying to be good athletically, academically, militarily. You show up there and everybody is a class president, a valedictorian. Everyone's they've lettered in some sport. Like everybody is very good. Everybody kind of came from this very high level background. And so all of a sudden you're very average, if not below average in some areas. And so I think some people have a hard time with that. For me, again, I was just so happy to be there. I was just like, all right, I'm just going to work my butt off and be really, try to be really good at all these things. But time management for me was the biggest. Like, how do I manage to fit in all these academics that were a lot harder than high school? How can I manage my time so that I can be good at everything? And it was tough. It definitely took a steep learning curve.
Yeah, I imagine that was pretty tricky, but you did end up making it through all 4 years. You graduated, and the Air Force is pretty much known for producing probably the more pilots out of any service, I would imagine, by the name. But you did end up going on to flight school to become a pilot. So what were some lessons that you learned in your time at flight school?
Yeah, flight school was, again, finally at where I wanted to be. This was my goal. This was everything that I had worked for, finally on that path. And then I get to flight school, and in the first few weeks, I am struggling with air sickness, which is, it's miserable. It's frustrating. Like I just want to fly. And meanwhile, I'm getting air sick. And I should have known. I had trouble with like car sickness as a kid and never really liked those amusement park rides. And yet I still wanted to be a pilot. But again, it's just a reminder sometimes that your path to your goals or your dreams isn't always like that straight, awesome, easy path, that you're going to face bumps in the road. And that was definitely a big one for me. And then also learning how to deal with failure and not being good at things. And how can you, if you make a mistake while you're flying, learning to acknowledge the mistake so that you don't do it again, but also to be able to let it go and move on so you can focus on flying. I think those are probably the biggest lessons, also the biggest challenges for me.
Yeah, those are some really great lessons that a lot of people could certainly learn from. But out of flight school, you did end up selecting to fly the A-10, as is seen behind you in the photo. So yeah, how did you pick the A-10, or did the A-10 pick you, and if so, why?
I think for me, I knew I wanted to fly fighters. Like that was, that was kind of in my plans from day one, but I didn't really know what I wanted to fly until I was in the T-38 training. So kind of the final phase and really just talking to other pilots about the missions of other aircraft. At the time when I was in pilot training, it was 1999, so pre 9/11. And I just remember talking to other A-10 pilots about the airplane and flying low level and supporting the troops on the ground. And for me, that was just a mission that I could really get behind. So it was about the mission for me. It was about ground troop support. And I remember at the time, there were people that were like, why do you want the A-10? Like, why not choose some sleek, sexy new fighter and not this like a little bit older, not so sleek, maybe a little ugly in some people's view. Why do you want the A-10? And I just said, look, it's about the mission for me. And so that's why I chose the A-10.
Yeah, I've always thought the A-10 has a great mission, and yeah, I think it's just overall a really cool jet. It's personally one of my favorites. But you mentioned you wanted to fly fighters, and I know there is a little bit of a debate over whether the A-10 is an attack or a fighter. So I gotta ask, which would you consider? Would you consider it more of a fighter or more of an attack?
You know, it's funny. A-10 pilots, we don't really care about this conversation, but other people really do care about it. So A stands for attack, A-10, right? So that's pretty straightforward. So it's an attack aircraft. However, the Air Force puts A-10s in fighter squadrons. So at the A-10 in every squadron I've been in, we have been in, for example, the 75th Fighter Squadron, the 47th Fighter Squadron. And so it gets a little confusing for everybody else. We don't really care because we know what our mission is and we're very confident in our mission and what we do. So we consider ourselves attack pilots and fighter pilots. If you want to get specific, the airplane is an attack aircraft. But we, as pilots, we also refer to ourselves as attack pilots and fighter pilots. Like it's not a big deal for us at all. We do our job. We focus on the mission.
Yeah, that's interesting to hear. I didn't know that wasn't a debate you all had. It was an outside external debate. But the A-10 is known for its gun. And I think a lot of people, I've heard that it's a big event getting to fire the gun for the first time. But what was it like firing that gun?
Yeah, it's pretty awesome because the reality is you're not really an A-10 pilot until you shoot the gun on the airplane for the first time. And it's a big deal, that I also taught in the A-10 course as well. So we bring the students out for their first time. And it was really fun for us as instructors as well. But I remember the first time as a student going out to the range, super excited, finally getting to the range and going to shoot the gun. And the first couple passes, you're dry. You're just kind of focused on the mechanics and your instructor is kind of tucked in right behind you. And then once they're confident in your ability to kind of execute the pass, they say, all right, next pass is hot. And, I remember rolling in and get cleared hot by the range controller and pulling on the trigger and the whole jet shakes. I mean, the whole thing shakes because you're sitting on top of the gun. So you can feel it like rumbling beneath you. You can smell the gun gases. You see them out front of the aircraft, and then you see the bullets impact the target. So pretty awesome, like full body experience to shoot the gun for the first time.
Yeah, I imagine that would be a pretty cool feeling. Yeah, I would in the future, I would love to get to fly the A-10. But yeah, that I don't know if that would happen because I hear they are going away.
Yeah, unfortunately, that seems to be the path.
Yeah, it must have been a pretty cool experience for those who got to do it. But
Definitely.
yeah, you did get sent to your first squadron, and from what I understand, you were the only woman there. So, what was that? What was that like?
Yeah, I mean, I finished pilot training in 2000. 9/11 happened while I was in A-10 training and then showed up to my first unit in December of 2001. There were very few female fighter pilots in the Air Force at the time. I think there were about 35 of us out of 3,500, so very small numbers. And I knew walking into my first squadron that I was going to be the only woman. And the reality is I probably put more pressure on myself than anybody else did because, I didn't want to make mistakes. I didn't want to ruin it for women that followed me. Like I just wanted to be really good at what I was doing. And so I took that pressure that I put on myself and kind of hunkered down and got in the books, studied, was in the vault, studying all the classified material and chair flew before every mission. So really practicing visualizing before every mission so that I could be good at what I was doing. And, what I really came to find out is that the guys just wanted me to be credible and capable in the airplane. I mean, jet does not know the difference. And so it's really about being good at what you do, being credible, being capable. And I think that applies to like both men and women. Anytime you're doing something new, I mean, people are watching, they're kind of judge you to see how well you do. And so for me, I focused on being credible and capable in the airplane. And then we deployed pretty quickly. So I got to prove myself in combat as well.
Yeah, that's a great point you bring up, that the airplane doesn't really care. So, yeah, anybody, yeah. So, I also understand that you were married to another A-10 pilot at that time, and I assume you still are as well. So, what was it like being married to a pilot and also getting to deploy and all that? I assume that must have been a little bit chaotic. So, how did that end up working out?
Yeah, chaos is a pretty good terminology. My husband and I, both A-10 pilots, we've been married for 25 years. And, the good side of both being A-10 pilots is we really understood what the other one was going through. We really, for lack of a better term, we were wingmen for each other, like partners. We got it. We got to talk about airplanes and flying at the dinner table. So it was fun, a lot of fun. The hard part about it is that at the time, they really didn't know what to do with a husband and wife, married couple in the same A-10 squadron. And so they split us in different A-10 squadrons, which meant that back in 2001, 2, 3, 4, 5, in our first 5 years of marriage, we spent very little time together because my squadron would deploy and then his squadron would deploy and then mine would deploy, his would deploy. So a little tricky from that perspective, but it really taught us the importance of communication and valuing our time together. So it really set us up well for the rest of our career and the rest of our marriage. And now we have two kids, they're 12 and 16, and we're also both retired now. So life is a little bit easier to navigate than the chaos of the early days.
Yeah, I've heard some stories from people who only one is a pilot or in the military and the other's at home, and they even have struggles. So that's awesome that you have gotten 20 years and more with that. So that's respectable. So your call sign, I see your call sign KC there, and also I'm pretty sure it stands for something. So you don't have to if you don't want to. But I always like asking and hearing
Yeah.
the call sign stories. I know some people don't like to share, but I always like to
No,
hear
it's
the call
fine.
sign stories.
No, it's
Share
fine.
yours.
Yeah, so we get our call sign in the A-10 community. For us, it's a big celebration. It's after you become combat mission ready in the airplane, and it's usually on a Friday night in our squadron bar, and just a celebration of kind of a rite of passage, if you will. And when you get your call sign, you're actually not in the room, and people tell stories about you while you're not in the room. So you're very nervous about what you walk back into. And I remember walking back in the room, everybody's yelling and cheering, and they're like, "Your new call sign is KC." And I was like, I didn't say this out loud, by the way, but I was thinking, like, that's super lame. Like, those are my initials, like, great creativity, guys. And then they said, well, it stands for killer chick. And I was like, all right, I can live with that. Like that was, to me, it was definitely a sign of respect from the guys in my squadron. So, and then once you fly with your call sign, it's in combat, it's yours for life. So we went to combat very early in my career. So I've been KC since really early days of my A-10 flying time.
Yeah, I've had a lot of Navy pilots on this show that they are not particularly happy about the call sign that they get, and some of them say that the Air Force pilots always get better call signs. Yours sounds pretty cool, so I don't know. That might be true.
Yeah, that's funny. I don't know. I don't know of any Iceman or Maverick in
Yeah,
the Air Force, but
yeah. But Killer Chick is a pretty cool call sign.
I'll
In
take it.
comparison to some of the other stories that I've heard recently. But yeah, so you ended up, like you mentioned, going on deployment and into combat in that time frame. And I'm sure you have tons of stories to share from that deployment, but of course, none more famous than the time where you got hit by enemy fire. So if you just want to take us through that day and kind of what was going on.
Yeah, what's crazy, that was my second deployment already. So in 2002, we were in Afghanistan, and then 2003, when this mission occurred, we deployed to Iraq for Iraqi freedom. And honestly, the early days of the war were really interesting because sometimes we would come home and we wouldn't have seen any action. We would have brought our ordnance home just because our ground troops were moving so fast. They weren't always facing resistance. And then And then as they approached Baghdad, everything really changed. And for us, what that meant as A-10 pilots, our role was, we would be there, we'd be ready when they called for us. And so on April 7th, we flew up to Baghdad. We had refueled, so full of gas and just kind of waiting to get a tasking. And unfortunately, that day the weather wasn't good. And so we couldn't see the ground below. Weren't sure if we were going to be able to do anything. And then we got a call, troops in contact, our guys are taking fire. And we're like, all right, it's go time. Now we're going to do everything we can to get below the weather and figure this out. And I remember we proceeded right over the top of the target area, and I watched my flight lead. He's like, all right, Casey, it's wedge shooters guns, which was the formation, how we were going to employ weapons. I'm frantically trying to get everything ready. And he just kind of rolls inverted and is gone, disappears down through the clouds to get below the weather. And then he tells me it's my turn. And I kind of look down, I find this hole in the clouds and then pop out below the weather. And I remember I can see this firefight. It's very surreal to me because these are things we talk about, we train for, and then to pop out below the weather and see tracers and smoke. And I mean, it was just very surreal in many ways. And as we're, talking to the ground controller and figuring out what's going on, I start to not only am I seeing these flashes and things happening across the river where there's this firefight between our troops and the Iraqi Republican Guard, all of a sudden I start to see these flashes and smoke around my airplane. And I realize okay, now they're not just having their own firefight. Now they're shooting up at us too. They clearly see us. And so we decide we're going to just do a couple passes, get in there really quick, put some firepower down on the enemy. And then as I'm coming off target from that second pass, it was a rocket pass, really just kind of trying to climb up, get away from the ground, get my altitude and airspeed back. And that's when I hear this huge explosion at the back of the airplane. And I immediately know, I'm like, okay, I'm hit. There is no doubt in my mind. The whole jet kind of front ends over. I see Baghdad below. I instinctively just kind of pull back on the control stick because I'm angling down at Baghdad. And when I pull back, nothing happens. And I'm like, oh, this is not good. That's not exactly what I said, but that's paraphrasing the best I can. Now I'm like, things are going very quickly through my mind. Am I going to have to eject over Baghdad? That is not going to be good because we were just strafing the enemy. And that's things are not going to go well. And so, I'm trying to, time slows down really for me. And as I'm plunging to the ground, I'm quickly analyzing what's happened in the cockpit, something we learn in pilot training, figuring out what's going on. And I immediately see that my hydraulics are at zero. So completely gone, which is how we fly an airplane. And at this point, my options are eject, which is not even a good choice. And then thankfully in the A-10, it's designed to take hits. So we have an emergency backup system. So I remember just very quickly flipping that switch and such a sense of relief as I pull back on the control stick now. And now the airplane starts to climb up and away from Baghdad. And that's really the first moment I'm like, okay, I think I can survive this. I can get out of here. I just need to get out of Baghdad. But then I had that hour-long flight home, and that was, in a heavily damaged airplane, flying all the way back to Kuwait and trying to make a decision of, do I try to land this heavily damaged airplane or do I just eject once we get to friendly territory? Probably the hardest decision I've ever made in my life.
Yeah, that's crazy. I can't even imagine what that hour-long flight back must have been like. And I'm just trying to think if I was in that situation, what would have been going through my head. I've never been strapped to an ejector seat before, so I'm trying to think if I was in an ejection seat, what would I have thought? Do I get out? But you clearly had to have been in a very good state of mind to stay calm and know what you needed to do in order to get back safely. So do you think there was something that really helped keep you calm in order to get back safely?
Nobody else was going to fly the airplane but me, right? So it's me or nobody. So that certainly helped. But I also had an awesome flight lead with me who became my wingman because he tucked in right next to me. And just talking through everything with him and having that mutual support definitely helped me stay calm and kind of be that calm under pressure. I'll be honest. There were a lot of crazy thoughts going through my mind, a lot of things of worst case scenarios. And at some point, you got to like push those out of the way and really just focus on the task at hand. And so we went through all sorts of checklists together. We talked through things. We just did the best that we could to, he was just very calming the whole way back. Like, how are you doing? Things are, he's like, this is a old war horse here. She's going to get you home. Like, he just very positive, but also he let me make that decision of, do I land or do I eject? And I think having, the confidence that he had in me to give me that choice to make that decision really gave me that confidence in myself. But after flying the airplane for an hour from Baghdad back to Kuwait, and then getting into Kuwait, doing a controllability check, just getting the gear down, making sure everything was operating as normal as it could, even though I didn't have a lot of systems with the loss of hydraulics. I think that's what gave me the full confidence. Like, I flew it for an hour. I felt very good with the airplane. We did the controllability check. It's still flying like relatively well, for a heavily damaged airplane. And I think that just gave me the confidence that I could land the airplane. And I felt like the right decision. Ejecting would have been an okay decision too. I just felt like landing the airplane was what I needed to do.
Yeah, that's interesting. And that, yeah, very respectable that you were able to actually get it back safely. I'm sure a lot of people that wouldn't have been able to happen. But now I don't know if you've seen the Sully movie, but I'm trying to think. I think in the Sully movie they showed him pushing the APU button, which was very crucial for them getting back safely. Now I'm wondering if there was anything like that for you when you were over in the skies. Was there anything you actually did in that cockpit? I think you talked about turning on the emergency systems. Was there something like that you did that now looking back, you think, if I hadn't done that, I don't know if I would be here today?
I really only had one switch that mattered at that point, and that was the manual reversion switch. I mean, if I hadn't done that, I would have been in a parachute over central Baghdad. But, that's, we train for these things. And Sully talks about a lot of it as well. It's about training and preparing for those moments. It's, putting yourself in difficult situations. For us, we do it in the simulator. You train for all sorts of terrible things in the airplane so that when that moment comes, you can be calm in the chaos. I mean, there's multiple things that we talk about. Aviate, navigate, communicate is one of them, that you fly the airplane first, then you can navigate and figure out where you're going, and then you communicate. There's also something that we learned is maintain aircraft control, analyze the situation, take the proper action, land as soon as conditions permit. So it's a very, because of our training, it's a very thoughtful process of how we work through things. And you'll see in both of those, the number one thing you got to do is fly the airplane, like fly the airplane first. Now, granted, I didn't have control of my airplane. So for me, it was, how do I get this airplane under control? Is there anything that I can do? And I really only had one thing. That one switch, I'm grateful for the people that designed the airplane that way, that, it was built to take hits, that it had this emergency backup system. Because without that, if I had been flying any other fighter, things would have been very different.
Yeah, the A-10 is from what I hear, a very impressive airplane. And that must have been a very scary experience. I can't even imagine what that must have been like.
Yep.
But from what I understand, you were still on deployment. You had to keep going. You all had a mission out there to do. So
Yeah.
how did you get back up and keep going?
You focus on the mission. You focus on the guys on the ground who need the help. And for me, that was it. I actually launched on April 8th, which was the day after this mission. And we were sitting combat search and rescue alert, which is another mission that we fly in the A-10, which means that if a pilot of any type gets shot down, we're going in to help assist with the rescue. And on April 8th, we were sitting alert, just kind of relaxing and sleeping out in our alert shack. And the alarm sounded, and it was an A-10 pilot had been shot down right up near Baghdad, right where I had escaped my own shoot down. But we just ran out to the jets as fast as we could. I mean, those guys were there for me the day before, and I knew I was going to do the same for this pilot. So that's the way I got back in the airplane. But, from then on out, it was like, yes, that was a terrifying, life-altering, life-defining experience that happened, but I kind of just had to tuck it all away and focus on the missions. And, at some point once I got home from the deployment, I definitely talked more about it, talked with my husband about it, and just, walked through it all, to kind of just talk through the scenarios and what happened. But on the deployment, I really just focused on our mission and that there were troops on the ground who needed us. And that was my job as an A-10 pilot, was to get in there and help them out.
Yeah, that's yeah, very impressive. And I guess there are just deployments from what I hear that are like that. That just chaos, like we said.
Yeah.
But after that very chaotic deployment, you did end up going to teach at the Air Force Academy. So how was that transition, and what was your job there?
Yeah, so that deployment was in 2003, which was obviously very early in my career. And I went on to fly the A-10 for public math here, like 15 more years after that. I spent time as a squadron commander, time as a group commander, responsible for all of our airmen in South America, Central America, and the Caribbean. So lots of jobs and roles beyond that first assignment. But I definitely look back on that first assignment as a fond one, just in terms of like the friends I made, the connections we had, and the work that we did. But I finished out my career at the Air Force Academy, which was kind of full circle moment for me to be able to go back to the academy, to go back where I started. It's where my husband and I met. But I went back to teach for 2 years, and I taught military and strategic studies. Got to share a lot of stories with cadets and share with them about some of the lessons I learned along the way. And then I spent my final year at the Air Force Academy as the director for the Center for Character and Leadership Development, which was just an awesome job to close everything out and, tie a bow on a 24-year career, if you will, just because it was a fantastic assignment, really helping cadets and getting them ready for, their next role as leaders in the Air Force and Space Force.
Yeah, well, I honestly can't think of many better people to teach character and leadership. But yeah, I'm assuming while teaching there, you also learned some lessons yourself. So what were some of the lessons that you learned while there?
I think the biggest thing for me is like, I believe in like, you never stop growing and learning. And, here I was really at the peak of my career in terms of my time in the Air Force at 24 years. I had, done a lot of different roles in combat and peacetime. I had led airmen deployed and at home. And, I felt like I had done a lot of things and experienced a lot of things. And yet here I am in this character and leadership role, learning from amazing people on my team who are experts in character and leadership development. And I think it really just taught me this, you never stop learning, you never should stop learning. You're constantly like getting new information, figuring out ways to be better, how to push yourself outside your comfort zone. And just continue to grow and learn, because it makes you better and it makes you better at helping others on their journey. So it was a great way to finish out my career.
Yeah, very full circle, and that is some great advice. Now, I want to take it back to the beginning when you talked about you looking up and seeing the Challenger explosion, and you wanted
Yeah.
to be an astronaut. Um,
Yeah.
from what I understand, you didn't end up becoming an astronaut. And you didn't go to test pilot school, I believe, but and I know that is a requirement. But are there reasons that you didn't end up becoming an astronaut, and do you wish you had?
Yeah. It's a funny question. I think all through my life, like that's what I wanted to do. And I kind of got to this point where I had to choose that path of, it was time to either go to test pilot school or choose a different path. And I really loved flying the A-10. I really loved what I was doing. I also was at the point in my life, I had been married. My husband and I had been married for 10 years. We were ready to have kids. And I just felt like I was happy where I was. And it's hard because sometimes when you work so hard to a goal, you set these goals for yourself, like to pivot was like, am I giving up on something? But what I realized is that my priorities had changed. And my priorities had changed, and that I love what I was doing and flying the A-10. It was at the point where I wanted to have a family. And so I stayed flying the A-10. Now, that being said, so I did not go on to become an astronaut, but like today I look at, there's a lot of opportunities out there. So I haven't closed the door just yet on those, on that idea. But no, I think going to space would be pretty amazing. I still think, there's still that like glimmer of hope that someday maybe there might be an opportunity. But the reality was priorities change and you adjust and you follow a new path. And, now I'm at this point in my life, been married 25 years. I have a 12-year-old, a 16-year-old. I'm retired from the Air Force. And now I'm on this new journey, which for me is helping others. It's leadership development, it's personal development. I've been able to write a book called Flying in the Face of Fear, which when you talk about a terrifying situation, that's where the term fear comes from. But it is about lessons on leading with courage and the courage we can use in our everyday lives. And sharing that message as a keynote speaker, I think to me, it's just been very rewarding and very impactful. And so, priorities change, things shift, and you just adjust as best you can.
Yeah, that's interesting. And astronaut or not, you have had, no doubt, a very impressive career. But yeah, and I know we're running short on time here, and you also hinted on my last question in that last statement. But yeah, what are you doing now, and what are you up to in the future? What's next for KC?
Yeah, I never thought I would be an author. That's for sure. Like I never had plans to be an author. And, I just realized along the way how many people shared their stories with me and the lessons. There's a book about A-10s during Desert Storm. And I remember reading that book, and that on that mission on the way home, I remember those stories. Like I remember the stories of other pilots who had flown in manual reversion. And those are the things that I remembered when I needed it, when I needed it most. And so I thought, well, how could I not share the stories, and maybe help someone else on their journey? So yeah, the book has been just an incredible way to connect with people. And then certainly now I do keynote speaking for businesses and organizations, just to share my story, share some of the lessons learned, provide that unique perspective. So, and then I'm a mom, I spend a lot of time, my boys both play soccer, and, I get to spend more time at home than I did when I was active duty in the military. So it's a great next chapter. I'm having fun. I'm enjoying it. More time with family and friends. And it's been a nice second chapter. We'll put it that way.
Yeah, it sounds like you've been doing some great things. And yeah, thank you so much for coming on and sharing some of your stories and lessons that you've learned. They've been great to hear, really, and I'm sure a lot of people will learn from it. Before we wrap this up, is there anything else you want to talk about? Did we miss anything?
No, you did great. I think we covered it all.
All right, well, thank you. That's all I've got.
All right, thanks for having me.